There is a logical fallacy that's taken center stage during this pandemic called appeal to authority, where we're expected to accept the opinion of experts as hard fact without examination. It's an easy trap to fall into when dealing with something as complex as CV that touches every aspect of our lives. But authority figures aren't in agreement. So where does that leave us? We appear to be divided into two broad camps: those who believe it's all a hoax designed to enslave us, and those who believe the virus is a legitimate threat to health where government controls are warranted to save lives. A well-known remedy to the fallacy, appeal to authority, is to question everything. But when we bump up against censorship, interfering with our ability to examine evidence, many become suspicious. This is fodder for the hoax theory. Another difficulty is cultural, where we've lost the ability to respectfully discuss and debate opposing viewpoints. The need to be right undermines our ability to be well informed, and we'd better be right, because if we aren't, we could be dead. So the division between us is fueled by our most basic survival instinct, and we can see this demonstrated in the battle between those who insist on mask wearing and those who insist on freedom of choice, refusing to don a mask by those who are able to do so. My job in constructing the Herbal Database is to examine evidence on all sides and present it to subscribers in a format that allows them to make their own educated opinion. Now, it's been months since I've made videos about CV. Frankly, I was hoping it would just go away, but it turned out there was such a flood of research for me to go through. I was changing up the section on COVID daily. At this point, its basic construction seems to stand on solid ground, so I'm confident I can restart this video series and help everybody come to grips with the situation. To get the most out of this, become a member of the Herbal Database, because I can't possibly take you through the whole thing. There are close to 30,000 topics, 500,000 articles, PDFs, videos, texts, many of which do relate to this topic directly or indirectly, depending on how far you want to go.
You don't need me to tell you all the ways that coronavirus has bent the world over and given us all a good COVIDing. But while we're depressingly familiar with the willful misinterpretation of science by those with ulterior motives, the contribution of scientists themselves to the confusion has flown a little bit under the radar unless you're particularly interested in the field. This is not a video about conspiracy theories. If you want to see that, you can just open Facebook. This is not a video about governments ignoring actual science or the media overhyping unproven therapies. If you want to see that, you can just switch on the news. And I'm not going to be picking the low-hanging fruit by making fun of idiotic politicians or Karens. If you want to see that, you can just switch on the late-night talk shows. Only joking, nobody's watching those. No, this is a video where I'm going to be concentrating on scientists who have actually made things worse. Don't get me wrong, those aforementioned groups, like politicians and the media, deserve a lot, perhaps most of the blame. But scientists are people who should have known better. If you're new to this channel, I guess I could summarize two of the main messages I try to convey by saying, always look beyond medical headlines to examine the evidence, and appreciate that uncertainty is inherent to science.
So that was one of the videos that you can watch in the database. Today we're going to cover just a few topics, beginning with the flu. Ever since this came out, folks have wondered and argued about whether it's just the flu. Is it? If not, what's the difference? And how would you ever know whether you had the flu or COVID or both of them? And what can testing tell us? And then we're going to also take a quick look at where we are right now in late September 2020. You're looking at COVID-19 in the Herbal Database. The topic in the center of the screen is what we're going to start with. Everything that surrounds it is related to it in some way, and we can just click on one of these to open it up. For example, we'll click on treatment, and this is just to show you how it works. Everything underneath here relates to treatment of COVID. We've got herbal treatments, for example, here. I'm going to just kind of go backwards now. And we're going to go back to the main heading. That's where we're going to start off. I'm going to open up the info panel using that little arrow in the lower right-hand corner. I could open it up all the way, like so. Up here, there are tabs that have different videos in them. And I'm going to go back to the notes section. And we're just going to take a quick look here. There's a menu with treatments, mortality, coping with it, origins of the virus, and as we scroll down, we've got a lot of text, articles, videos, and so on. Whether we get sick or not only has to do with the pathogens or germs we're exposed to, but even more importantly, our terrain. Now, the terrain is an historical concept that is talking about the overall state of health, our microbiome, our genetics, etc. And we've been hearing all about folks who are most at risk being those with underlying health issues. In fact, we see here that according to the CDC, 41% of Americans are at high risk because of health issues. 6 out of 10 have a chronic illness, 75% are overweight, 42% are obese, 1 in 2 have prediabetes or diabetes, 88% are metabolically unhealthy, and these are all inflammatory conditions which are modifiable largely through diet, and they all make it more likely that you'll have severe complications or die. And that's true whether it's the flu or COVID or any other infection. The number to pay attention to in your area is the hospitalizations, not so much the case numbers. If those numbers go down, it's pointing to herd immunity, but if they go up, it signals a change in the epidemiological dynamics. So as of late September 2020, there has been an inflection point in confirmed cases in the U.S. around September 7th and 8th. The 2 states with the big numbers are Texas and Arizona. And you've probably heard there are huge numbers of infections in India and Europe, so stay vigilant. Technically, this would be the 3rd wave. But the 3rd wave of what? The flu or COVID-19? Let's go over to symptoms. Before I cover this, I'm going to scroll down. The symptoms of COVID-19 and the 1918 Spanish flu, H1N1, are very similar. In both, inability to get enough oxygen is a major symptom. The 1918 flu was called the Blue Death for that reason. It was also responsible for a cytokine storm. We now know that there was a severe outbreak of H1N1 that broke out late 2019 through 2020, in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic. But in mid-March, flu statistics were abruptly halted globally. In the United States, more people have died from influenza than COVID-19, according to the CDC's own data. So there may be 2 pandemics at play, and one of the mistakes the World Health Organization made was by turning off the data for the influenza pandemic so abruptly, and all of a sudden it appears that there are no deaths from influenza and it's all COVID-19. A 5-year report from Public Health England on all-cause mortality showed the spike in H3N2, which is a variant of H1N1, and we see a spike in deaths that exceeds every previous year on the chart, and here you see right here. So this is one of the things that made folks very suspicious. It led a lot of fuel to the argument that we were just looking at a flu epidemic all along. How do we differentiate COVID symptoms from those of this severe type of flu? And do we need to in terms of treating it? So there are a bunch of videos and articles here, but I'm going to scroll back up to this little chart and we'll talk about some of the differences. We're just going to look at the comparison between COVID-19 and the flu. Here we're really talking about, I would say, the ordinary kind of flus that people are used to, not so much the really, really severe, life-threatening H1N1 type of flu, although these symptoms will appear there too. In terms of fever, it's common in COVID-19. We're looking at around 100 degrees or higher Fahrenheit. Flu, same. In the flu, it lasts for about 3 to 4 days. Headaches, sometimes in COVID. Intense with the flu. General aches and pains, sometimes in COVID. Common and often very severe in the flu. Fatigue and weakness, sometimes with COVID. Common and often severe in the flu. Extreme exhaustion, sometimes in COVID, and it progresses slowly. With the flu, it starts early. And people that I know who've had COVID say that their exhaustion was far more serious and extreme than anything they've ever experienced with influenza. A stuffy nose is rare in COVID. You sometimes have it in the flu. Sneezing, rare in COVID, sometimes in the flu. Sore throat is also rare, but common in the flu. Cough is common in both of them, and it can become severe in the flu. Shortness of breath in more serious infections in the cases of COVID, and it's rare in the flu. So there's a real sign there. Shortness of breath is one of the red flags for COVID, and that can come on even when you don't seem to have very severe symptoms of any other kind. And we'll get more into that later. A runny nose is rare in COVID, sometimes in the flu. And diarrhea you can have sometimes in both of them. Something important to note is that with COVID, the way it's classified, if folks don't need oxygen, but they have really severe symptoms, that's classified as a mild case. It's not considered severe until they need oxygen supplementation. And critical is when they have respiratory failure or multi-organ failure. So just because we hear about so many cases with mild symptoms, please know those people could be really, really sick. Now let's take a look at another unique feature of COVID from influenza. I'm scrolling down to this. So we now know that it affects the ability of blood to carry oxygen. And this is quite interesting. There can be low oxygen saturation, but people are not very short of breath. And you could test this at home. You can get an inexpensive oxygen meter. They're available on Amazon. Practice when you're not ill to know what your normal saturation level is. Here's an example of a test where the saturation level is 98%. That's good. We see the heart rate too here. The oxygen saturation's too low when it drops below 90% or is consistently between 90 to 94%. And folks who are at home dealing with this, that's when it's recommended to go to the hospital, when your oxygen saturation gets too low. And one of the difficulties here that they've learned is that it's not so much that you need oxygen itself, it's that your blood can't carry it. So that's a complication that medicine has been recently learning about and figuring out what to do. Now, another unique feature of COVID, now this isn't in everyone, but a lot of people lose their sense of taste and or smell. That is a red flag that it's COVID. That doesn't happen in the flu or a cold unless there's a severe sinus infection. And I think just about everybody's had a really bad stuffy nose where you can't smell or taste. That's not what's going on here. There's no sign of any kind of symptom in the upper respiratory tract in the sinus area. But there's no taste, no smell. The reason for this seems to be the way COVID affects the peripheral nervous system. It seems that the virus affects the sense of smell receptors at the roof of the nose. There are a few other differences between influenza and SARS-CoV-2 that are worth taking note of. Unlike influenza, the SARS-CoV-2 targets a receptor called the ACE2 receptor. That's something that's found pretty much throughout the body. and accounts for why there can be such diverse ranges of symptoms in people. Also, in why some people have less severe symptoms. For example, there are differences in the number of those receptors in various races and also in genders. Men tend to have more of them than women, and it's thought to account for why this disease is more severe, usually, in men than in women. Influenza has a completely different mechanism for entering and infecting the body, and its focus is on the respiratory tract. Now, of course, there are muscle aches and fever and other similar symptoms, but those are signs that the immune system is geared up and fighting it. Of course, a lot of the symptoms in COVID are also symptoms of the immune system. In fact, it's said that the virus itself in COVID tends to clear the body in just a few days, and now it's the immune system that's gone into overdrive that's causing problems. Something else that's interesting is a lot of folks have reported that they had symptoms of old diseases that they thought they had long recovered from. Folks with Lyme, for example, had their Lyme symptoms flare up. People who had early childhood ear infections noticed that they were having a kind of like a flare-up of problems with their ears and hearing. So one way to think about this is that when symptoms diverge from typical influenza symptoms, that could be an indication that it is COVID. As many have already indicated, symptoms can be exactly the same as influenza. If so, how do you know which one it is, and does it really matter? Can you treat them both in a similar fashion? Let's move on to testing. Well, testing for COVID-19 has turned out to be very complicated. In this section of the database, I spell out exactly why from a lot of different studies that have come out. You'll see videos here about PCR testing, diagnosing, etc. I'm just going to give you the information in a nutshell format. First of all, we know that the PCR test is not reliable because there can be a lot of false positives and false negatives. There was a study that came out of Oxford recently, and that study is right here. It's really worth looking at because it explains in detail that if you have a positive PCR test, it may be finding dead traces of old infections, resulting in false positives, and those inflate the scale of the pandemic. Now, the question when it finds traces of the virus is the virus active, infectious, or virulent? And the PCR alone cannot answer that question. There has to be a second kind of test, which is a viral culture. Their viruses are injected in laboratory cell lines to see if they do cause cell damage and death, releasing a new set of viruses that can go on to infect other cells. Without that test, you just don't know what the PCR positive means. There's a lot more about that, but there's another issue here. This is an example that came out recently from Ohio. There, if you test positive, your result is sent on to the Department of Public Safety, and from there it's entered into the law enforcement automated data system used to alert officers of arrest warrants, stolen vehicles, etc., and no COVID-19. HIPAA laws don't apply to COVID testing, and that's the law that says your health records are your own. There are, in many areas, criminal penalties for not wearing masks or following other restrictions. You need to find out if this is the case in your state or country, because if you're tested and you have a positive result, as this study here and many others points out, it doesn't mean you are infected or infectious. So there are issues with the testing. Now, I'm just going to scroll down and show you some of the other tests. There are other tests coming out. How to fix the testing, antibody testing versus PCR testing. The antibody testing is turning out not to be so great, by the way. There's a blood test, a new tool. Here's a lot on the PCR test. It's an RT-PCR test that's only 60 to 70% accurate. More about false negatives and false positives. Therefore, it's often given several times. And there have been cases where the first 3 tests came up negative, but the 4th was positive. It's not reliable. So At any rate, the testing isn't all that helpful to us. It's worth doing, and it may be required. If you need to be tested to go back to work or to school, you may have to do that test. But just know that there are some complications. Come in the database and check out that section. So my friends, I'm going to leave it there, and we're going to come back in another video and cover some more of this. Thank you for watching. I hope that you all stay well and healthy. Stay vigilant, and next time we're going to talk about prevention that includes masks, vaccines, etc. See you next time. Bye.